It was a sweltering afternoon, the kind that made the air thick and uncomfortable. The subway station was packed with people, all trying to get home or to their destinations. Among the sea of faces, there was a particular tension that simmered in the air. Patricia, a young black woman, stood by the edge of the platform, her hand resting on her swollen belly. She was 8 months pregnant, and every step felt like a chore. The weight of her child was a constant reminder of the new life she was about to bring into the world, but it also made it difficult to move around, especially in the bustling city. The subway screeched to a halt, its doors sliding open with a loud clatter. People hurriedly piled in, trying to claim whatever seats were available. Patricia waited patiently, her hand on her stomach, her other gripping the pole beside her as she made her way into the crowded train. She scanned the seats, hoping someone would be kind enough to offer her a place to sit. Most people kept their heads down, eyes glued to their phones, pretending not to notice her. She sighed, used to the cold indifference of city life. But then, she spotted an open seat in the corner. Her face lit up with relief as she slowly made her way toward it. Just as she reached the seat, a man, pale, middle-aged, with graying hair and a sneer that could curdle milk, slid into the seat before her. His eyes met hers, and for a brief moment, there was a silent exchange. He knew she needed the seat. It was obvious. But instead of offering it to her, he smirked and leaned back comfortably, his arms crossed over his chest. "Excuse me," Patricia said, her voice polite but firm. "Would you mind letting me sit? I'm 8 months pregnant." The man glanced at her belly and then back at her face, his expression unchanging. "Not my problem," he muttered under his breath. Patricia blinked, unsure if she'd heard him correctly. "I'm sorry." "You heard me," he said louder this time, his voice thick with disdain. "I don't owe you anything. I got here first." Several heads turned in their direction, passengers now curious about the brewing confrontation. Patricia felt her pulse quicken, but she kept her composure. "I'm just asking for a little kindness. It's not easy standing like this." The man chuckled, a dark, humorless sound. "Maybe you should have thought about that before you got knocked up." Patricia's face flushed with a mixture of embarrassment and anger. She looked around, hoping someone would intervene, but the other passengers remained silent, their eyes averted. It was as if they were watching a train wreck, unwilling to step in but unable to look away. Her hand gripped the pole tighter, her knuckles turning white. She wasn't going to let this man intimidate her. "I'm just asking for a seat. That's all. Please." He leaned forward, his face inches from hers, his breath foul and sour. "I don't give a damn what you're asking for. Get lost." The atmosphere in the subway car shifted. The tension was thick, and Patricia could feel the eyes of everyone on her. She didn't want to cause a scene, but she also couldn't just stand there and accept this level of disrespect. Not today. Not when she was this close to bringing a new life into the world. Before she could respond, a young man, probably in his mid-20s, stood up from his seat across the aisle. He was tall, muscular, and wore a baseball cap that shadowed his face. "You can take my seat, ma'am," he said, his voice calm but firm. Patricia smiled at him, grateful for the gesture, but before she could move, the older man shot up from his seat, his face twisted with rage. "Mind your own damn business, kid," he barked, stepping in front of the young man. The young man didn't flinch. "You're being a jerk, man. She's pregnant. Just let her sit down." The older man's face flushed with anger. "I don't care what you think. You don't tell me what to do." He shoved the young man, hard, pushing him back into the seat. A collective gasp went through the subway car. Patricia's heart raced, fear creeping into her chest. This was escalating far faster than she anticipated. The young man stood back up, his eyes locked onto the older man. "You want to do this?" he asked quietly, his fists clenched at his sides. The older man sneered, his fists raised, ready to fight. You think you can take me, punk? Suddenly, there was a loud crack, the unmistakable sound of gunfire. The subway car erupted into chaos. People screamed, ducking for cover as the sound echoed through the confined space. Patricia's heart pounded in her chest as she instinctively shielded her belly, crouching down beside one of the seats. The young man had pulled out a gun, his hands trembling as he pointed it at the older man. Back off, he growled, his voice shaking with both fear and anger. Just back off. The older man froze, his eyes wide with shock. He hadn't expected this. No one had. Put the gun down, someone screamed from the back of the car, their voice panicked. Patricia's breath hitched as she looked between the two men. This was getting out of control. She had only wanted a seat, and now she was caught in the middle of something far more dangerous. Please, she whispered, her voice barely audible over the chaos. Just stop. But the young man's eyes were locked onto the older man, his finger hovering dangerously close to the trigger. The subway car felt like it was about to explode, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Put it down, kid, the older man said, his voice trembling now. You don't want to do this. The gun wavered in the young man's hand, his breath coming out in short, panicked gasps. Patricia could see the conflict in his eyes, the fear that he was losing control of the situation. The subway continued to move, but inside the car, time seemed to stand still. Patricia's eyes widened in horror as she saw the older man's hand inching toward the gun. The chaos in the subway car seemed to swirl around her in slow motion, shouts, scuffling feet, and the desperate movements of the young man trying to fend off the angry crowd. "No!" she screamed, rushing forward in an attempt to stop what was about to happen. Her feet moved faster than her thoughts, but the older man's hand reached the gun first. A sinister grin spread across his face as his fingers curled around the handle, and with a swift motion, he picked it up, straightening to his full height. "Everyone back off," the older man barked, his voice cutting through the noise. The crowd froze, and the young man, now bruised and on the floor, glanced up in terror. The power dynamic had shifted once again. Patricia could feel the tension snap back into the air, like a bowstring pulled too tight. The older man, now armed, stood at the center of it all, his chest puffed up with newfound authority. He waved the gun around carelessly, his hand trembling with rage and excitement. "You all think you can gang up on me," he shouted, his voice dripping with fury. "I've had enough of this. You don't know who you're dealing with." Patricia could feel her pulse pounding in her ears. The situation had spiraled even further out of control. The older man was unpredictable, and now that he had the gun, there was no telling what he might do. She had to act fast. Taking a deep breath, she stepped forward, keeping her hands raised in a gesture of peace. "Please, let's not make this any worse," she said, her voice steady but urgent. "Put the gun down. We can still end this without anyone getting hurt." The older man's eyes darted toward Patricia, his face twisted with contempt. "You're part of the problem," he spat. "People like you, always expecting special treatment, always causing trouble. I'm not backing down." As he spoke, the gun in his hand wavered, his grip unsteady. Patricia knew that if she didn't find a way to calm him down, someone was going to get hurt, or worse. From the corner of her eye, Patricia saw movement. One of the passengers, a tall man in a baseball cap, had been slowly inching closer to the older man, trying to get within striking distance. But the older man was too aware of his surroundings. In a flash, he swung the gun toward the approaching figure. "Stay back," he shouted, his finger dangerously close to the trigger. The man in the baseball cap froze, his hands raised in surrender. All right," he said, backing away slowly. "No need to shoot." Patricia's heart raced. The older man was clearly on edge, and any sudden movement could set him off. She had to keep talking, keep him distracted long enough for someone to come up with a plan. "Why are you doing this?" Patricia asked, trying to keep her voice calm despite the fear clawing at her insides. "You don't need to hurt anyone. We can all just walk away from this." The older man laughed, a cold, bitter sound. "Walk away? You think I'm just going to walk away after all this? After what that punk did?" He gestured toward the young man, still lying on the floor, his face bruised from the earlier scuffle. "He tried to stand up for me," Patricia said, her voice soft but firm. "He didn't mean for things to get out of hand. None of us did. We just want this to end peacefully." "Peacefully?" The older man sneered. "There's no peace in this world, sweetheart. Not for people like me. You all want to gang up on me, make me out to be the bad guy. But I'm not the one who started this." Patricia's mind raced as she tried to think of what to say next. Every second that passed felt like a countdown to disaster. She glanced around the subway car, searching for any sign of help. The other passengers were frozen in place, their faces pale with fear. No one knew what to do. Suddenly, a sharp jolt shook the subway car, and the lights flickered. The train was slowing down, approaching the next station. Patricia's heart leapt with a mixture of hope and dread. The police would likely be waiting at the platform, but if the older man still had the gun when they arrived, things could get even worse. The older man seemed to realize this too. His eyes darted toward the door, and his grip on the gun tightened. "Nobody move," he shouted, his voice growing more frantic. "I'm not going to jail for this." The train screeched to a halt, and the doors hissed open. For a brief moment, the world outside the subway car was visible, a bustling station, oblivious to the drama unfolding inside. Patricia's mind raced. If the police were out there, they'd be coming in any second. She had to do something. The older man backed toward the open door, his eyes wild with desperation. "Stay where you are," he barked, waving the gun around. "I'll shoot anyone who tries to follow me." Patricia's pulse quickened. If he escaped with the gun, who knew what he might do next? She couldn't let that happen. In a split-second decision, Patricia lunged forward, grabbing hold of the older man's arm. The force of her movement knocked him off balance, and the gun slipped from his grasp, clattering to the floor. For a heartbeat, everything seemed to freeze. The passengers, the older man, even Patricia herself, all caught in the tension of the moment. And then, as if waking from a trance, the young man on the floor sprang into action. He scrambled toward the gun, his fingers closing around it just as the older man regained his footing. The older man turned toward him, eyes blazing with fury, but before he could make a move, the young man leveled the gun at him, his hands steady this time. "Don't move," the young man said, his voice low and dangerous. The subway car fell into an eerie silence once again, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Patricia's breath caught in her throat as she waited to see what would happen next. The subway car was frozen in an almost surreal tableau. The young man stood with the gun now in his hands, his eyes fixed on the older man who had caused the chaos. His hands trembled ever so slightly, but he kept his focus, determined not to let the situation spiral out of control again. Patricia's heart pounded in her chest as she stood just a few feet away from them, still processing what had just happened. She couldn't believe that things had escalated to this point. She had never imagined she'd be in the middle of a confrontation like this, one with guns, fear, and the very real possibility of violence. But there she was, standing in the eye of the storm, feeling the weight of every second that passed. The older man, realizing his weapon had been turned against him, seemed to deflate slightly. His bravado had waned, but the anger in his eyes remained as fierce as ever. He glared at the young man, clearly trying to calculate his next move. "You don't have it in you, kid," he sneered, stepping forward. "You think you're some kind of hero? You're nothing." The young man didn't budge, his grip tightening on the gun. "Don't test me," he warned, though there was an edge of uncertainty in his voice. It was clear he didn't want to shoot, but he wasn't about to let the older man continue terrorizing the passengers. Patricia, sensing the growing tension between the two, decided to intervene. "Listen," she said, stepping cautiously between them, "we don't need to keep going down this path. It's over now. Just let it go." She glanced at the young man, trying to convey calm. "Put the gun down. No one needs to get hurt anymore." The young man blinked, his chest heaving from the adrenaline coursing through his veins. He looked uncertain, torn between wanting to do the right thing and the overwhelming pressure of the moment. Patricia could see the conflict in his eyes. The gun represented power in this volatile situation, but it also came with the weight of immense responsibility. He started, but before he could finish, the subway doors slid open again. This time, a group of uniformed police officers rushed into the car, their own weapons drawn and pointed at the passengers. "Drop the gun." "Hands in the air," one of the officers shouted, his voice booming in the confined space. Panic surged through the car as passengers instinctively raised their hands, their fear now compounded by the sudden presence of the police. The young man, caught off guard by the arrival of law enforcement, hesitated for a split second too long. His hesitation, combined with the officer's high-strung nerves, created a deadly mix of tension. "Drop it." "Now," the officer barked again, stepping closer, his gun trained directly on the young man's chest. Patricia's heart sank. She knew how quickly things could escalate when officers arrived on the scene, especially when someone was holding a weapon. The young man was trapped, caught between the police and the older man who had ignited the chaos in the first place. "He's not the bad guy," Patricia shouted, her voice rising in desperation. "He was just trying to protect himself." The officers, tense and alert, didn't lower their weapons. Their eyes were locked on the young man, who was still holding the gun. He looked around, panicked, his gaze flickering between the officers and Patricia. The weight of the situation was crashing down on him, and it showed in the way his hands shook. "I'm not going to shoot," the young man finally said, his voice cracking with fear. Slowly, painfully, he began to lower the gun, his fingers trembling as he bent down to place it on the floor. Just as he set the gun down, the older man, seeing an opportunity, lunged forward with a sudden burst of energy. His hand shot toward the gun, and for a moment, everything seemed to happen in slow motion. The officers reacted, shouting commands, while the passengers gasped in shock. Patricia's instincts kicked in. She threw herself between the older man and the gun, her hands outstretched in a desperate attempt to block his path. The older man collided with her, knocking her off balance, but she managed to hold her ground, keeping him from reaching the weapon. "You're done," Patricia screamed at him, her voice filled with both anger and exhaustion. "You're not getting away with this." The older man snarled, his frustration boiling over as he tried to push past her. But before he could make another move, the police officers closed in, tackling him to the floor with swift, practiced motions. The gun was quickly kicked out of reach as the officers restrained him, his hands pulled roughly behind his back. "Get off me," the older man yelled, his voice muffled as his face was pressed against the cold subway floor. The tension in the subway car began to ease, though the atmosphere remained thick with unease. Patricia took a step back, breathing heavily, as the officers finished subduing the older man. The young man who had originally been holding the gun stood off to the side, his hand still raised in surrender as the police approached him. One of the officers, a woman with a stern expression, nodded to him. "You okay, son?" The young man swallowed hard, clearly shaken by everything that had happened. Yeah, I'm okay." Patricia could finally feel the adrenaline starting to fade, leaving her with a deep sense of exhaustion. She watched as the officers led the older man away, his protests growing weaker with each step. The other passengers remained silent, their eyes wide as they tried to process everything they had just witnessed. The officer who had spoken to the young man turned to Patricia, offering a tight-lipped smile of reassurance. "You did good, ma'am," she said. "You helped prevent this from getting worse." Patricia nodded, though her mind was still spinning. She couldn't believe how close they had all come to disaster. Her thoughts returned to the older man, the hatred in his eyes, the way he had refused to back down, even when faced with the consequences of his actions. She wondered how someone could hold on to so much rage, to the point where they were willing to risk everything just to prove a point. The aftermath of the confrontation was palpable, a silence hanging heavy in the subway car, broken only by the faint crackling of police radios. The older man, now restrained and dragged out of the car, left behind an uneasy calm. The passengers, still visibly shaken, exchanged glances, unsure of what had just transpired and what it meant for the safety they had assumed in this shared public space. Patricia slumped into a nearby seat, her mind still reeling from the intensity of the situation. Her legs felt weak, and her hands trembled slightly as she ran them through her hair. She had always known the world was full of ugliness, but to be confronted with it so directly, so violently, had left her with a feeling she couldn't quite place: anger, fear, and a strange mixture of relief. The young man, who had been at the center of it all, looked utterly drained. He leaned against one of the subway poles, his eyes unfocused as if still trying to comprehend how things had spiraled out of control so quickly. He had been thrust into a situation that most people would never have imagined being in, faced with a gun, the pressure of life and death decisions, and now the sudden shock of having narrowly avoided disaster. One of the officers approached the young man cautiously. "You did the right thing by putting the gun down," she said in a calm but authoritative voice, lowering her weapon. "But we're going to need to take you in for questioning. Standard procedure." The young man nodded weakly, his voice hoarse from the strain of the situation. "I understand," he said, though there was a lingering fear in his tone. The idea of being taken in by the police, even if it was just for questioning, added a new layer of anxiety to an already overwhelming experience. Patricia noticed the shift in the young man's expression, sensing the uncertainty that hung in the air. "He didn't do anything wrong," she interjected, her voice steadier now as she stood up. "He was just trying to protect everyone." The officer nodded, her expression softening slightly. "We know that. But we still need to take statements from everyone involved. It's just protocol." The other passengers began to murmur quietly among themselves, their relief at the resolution of the situation mixed with nervousness about what would happen next. Patricia looked around at the faces in the car, recognizing the shared trauma they had just experienced. Everyone had been witness to the unfolding chaos, each person a silent observer of the man's hateful actions and the subsequent confrontation. As the subway began to move again, the rhythmic clattering of the train on the tracks provided an unsettling backdrop to the tense atmosphere. The remaining officers stood guard near the doors, watching over the passengers, while the police officer next to Patricia turned toward her. "You're going to need to come with us too, ma'am," the officer said gently. "We need to take your statement, especially since you were directly involved." Patricia nodded, already expecting this. The reality of the situation was settling in. She was at the heart of what had happened, after all, the pregnant black woman whose need for a seat had sparked the confrontation, the woman who had thrown herself between the two men when things had escalated. She couldn't walk away from this now, not when her involvement had been so crucial to the way it all played out. As the train rolled on toward the next station, the weight of the moment continued to press down on her. She couldn't stop thinking about the older man, his snarling face, his smearing insults, the way he had refused to see her as anything more than a target for his hatred. She wondered what had driven him to that point, what had turned him into someone who could harbor so much anger, so much poison. But Patricia wasn't interested in pitying him. She was angry. Angry that she had to deal with someone like him in the first place, angry that her pregnancy and her race were enough to trigger such hostility from a complete stranger. The way he had looked at her, like she was less than human, was something that would stay with her long after this moment had passed. The train finally came to a stop at the next station, and the doors slid open with a hiss. Several police officers were waiting on the platform, their radios crackling with updates as they prepared to escort Patricia, the young man, and the other passengers off the subway. The officers moved with a sense of urgency but remained calm, guiding everyone out of the car one by one. Patricia stepped onto the platform, feeling the cold concrete under her feet. The station was eerily quiet, a stark contrast to the chaos that had erupted just minutes before. She glanced back at the subway car, seeing the place where the older man had sat, where everything had begun. It seemed strange that such a small, insignificant moment, the act of sitting, could lead to something so explosive. As she was led through the station, she noticed the crowd of people gathered on the far end of the platform. Curious onlookers, commuters who had been waiting for the next train, now stared at the scene unfolding before them. Their eyes followed Patricia and the others as they were escorted toward a set of waiting police vehicles outside the station. The young man was led into one of the squad cars, his face still pale, but he didn't resist. He looked over at Patricia briefly, offering her a small, weary nod before disappearing into the back seat of the car. Patricia wondered what would happen to him now, if he would be okay, if the officers would believe his story, if the weight of everything he had done would come crashing down on him once the adrenaline wore off. Patricia was directed toward another vehicle, her mind still racing with thoughts of what had just transpired. As she climbed into the back of the police car, she leaned her head back against the seat and closed her eyes for a moment, trying to find some sense of peace in the chaos. Just as the door was about to close, a sudden sound shattered the momentary calm, an explosion of gunfire, sharp and loud, echoing through the station. Patricia's eyes flew open, her heart racing once again. She instinctively ducked down in the back seat, her hands covering her head as she tried to make sense of the noise. The sound of more gunshots followed, rapid and relentless, as the police officers outside scrambled to react. Chaos erupted once again. Shouts filled the air, and Patricia could hear the frantic footsteps of people running in every direction. The sound of the gunfire seemed to come from all around her, and she couldn't tell where it was coming from or who was behind it. The aftermath of the confrontation was palpable, a silence hanging heavy in the subway car, broken only by the faint crackling of police radios. The older man, now restrained and dragged out of the car, left behind an uneasy calm. The passengers, still visibly shaken, exchanged glances, unsure of what had just transpired and what it meant for the safety they had assumed in this shared public space. Patricia slumped into a nearby seat, her mind still reeling from the intensity of the situation. Her legs felt weak, and her hands trembled slightly as she ran them through her hair. She had always known the world was full of ugliness, but to be confronted with it so directly, so violently, had left her with a feeling she couldn't quite place: anger, fear, and a strange mixture of relief. The young man, who had been at the center of it all, looked utterly drained. He leaned against one of the subway poles, his eyes unfocused as if still trying to comprehend how things had spiraled out of control so quickly. He had been thrust into a situation that most people would never have imagined being in, faced with a gun, the pressure of life and death decisions, and now the sudden shock of having narrowly avoided disaster. One of the officers approached the young man cautiously. "You did the right thing by putting the gun down," she said in a calm but authoritative voice, lowering her weapon. "But we're going to need to take you in for questioning. Standard procedure." The young man nodded weakly, his voice hoarse from the strain of the situation. "I understand," he said, though there was a lingering fear in his tone. The idea of being taken in by the police, even if it was just for questioning, added a new layer of anxiety to an already overwhelming experience. Patricia noticed the shift in the young man's expression, sensing the uncertainty that hung in the air. "He didn't do anything wrong," she interjected, her voice steadier now as she stood up. "He was just trying to protect everyone." The officer nodded, her expression softening slightly. "We know that. But we still need to take statements from everyone involved. It's just protocol." The other passengers began to murmur quietly among themselves, their relief at the resolution of the situation mixed with nervousness about what would happen next. Patricia looked around at the faces in the car, recognizing the shared trauma they had just experienced. Everyone had been witness to the unfolding chaos, each person a silent observer of the man's hateful actions and the subsequent confrontation. As the subway began to move again, the rhythmic clattering of the train on the tracks provided an unsettling backdrop to the tense atmosphere. The remaining officers stood guard near the doors, watching over the passengers, while the police officer next to Patricia turned toward her. "You're going to need to come with us too, ma'am," the officer said gently. "We need to take your statement, especially since you were directly involved." Patricia nodded, already expecting this. The reality of the situation was settling in. She was at the heart of what had happened, after all, the pregnant black woman whose need for a seat had sparked the confrontation, the woman who had thrown herself between the two men when things had escalated. She couldn't walk away from this now, not when her involvement had been so crucial to the way it all played out. As the train rolled on toward the next station, the weight of the moment continued to press down on her. She couldn't stop thinking about the older man, his snarling face, his smearing insults, the way he had refused to see her as anything more than a target for his hatred. She wondered what had driven him to that point, what had turned him into someone who could harbor so much anger, so much poison. But Patricia wasn't interested in pitying him. She was angry. Angry that she had to deal with someone like him in the first place, angry that her pregnancy and her race were enough to trigger such hostility from a complete stranger. The way he had looked at her, like she was less than human, was something that would stay with her long after this moment had passed. The train finally came to a stop at the next station, and the doors slid open with a hiss. Several police officers were waiting on the platform, their radios crackling with updates as they prepared to escort Patricia, the young man, and the other passengers off the subway. The officers moved with a sense of urgency but remained calm, guiding everyone out of the car one by one. Patricia stepped onto the platform, feeling the cold concrete under her feet. The station was eerily quiet, a stark contrast to the chaos that had erupted just minutes before. She glanced back at the subway car, seeing the place where the older man had sat, where everything had begun. It seemed strange that such a small, insignificant moment, the act of sitting, could lead to something so explosive. As she was led through the station, she noticed the crowd of people gathered on the far end of the platform. Curious onlookers, commuters who had been waiting for the next train, now stared at the scene unfolding before them. Their eyes followed Patricia and the others as they were escorted toward a set of waiting police vehicles outside the station. The young man was led into one of the squad cars, his face still pale, but he didn't resist. He looked over at Patricia briefly, offering her a small, weary nod before disappearing into the back seat of the car. Patricia wondered what would happen to him now, if he would be okay, if the officers would believe his story, if the weight of everything he had done would come crashing down on him once the adrenaline wore off. Patricia was directed toward another vehicle, her mind still racing with thoughts of what had just transpired. As she climbed into the back of the police car, she leaned her head back against the seat and closed her eyes for a moment, trying to find some sense of peace in the chaos. Just as the door was about to close, a sudden sound shattered the momentary calm, an explosion of gunfire, sharp and loud, echoing through the station. Patricia's eyes flew open, her heart racing once again. She instinctively ducked down in the back seat, her hands covering her head as she tried to make sense of the noise. The sound of more gunshots followed, rapid and relentless, as the police officers outside scrambled to react. Chaos erupted once again. Shouts filled the air, and Patricia could hear the frantic footsteps of people running in every direction. The sound of the gunfire seemed to come from all around her, and she couldn't tell where it was coming from or who was behind it. The air was thick with tension, the staccato of gunfire echoing through the station like thunderclaps in a storm. Patricia's breath came in short, ragged bursts as she remained huddled in the back of the police car, her heart pounding against her ribs. The sharp crack of each bullet felt like a physical blow, sending shockwaves of fear through her. Outside, the subway station had devolved into chaos once more, the brief calm shattered as quickly as it had come. "Stay down," one of the officers barked, his voice barely audible over the gunfire. The police outside scrambled for cover, drawing their weapons and moving in coordinated patterns, their movements sharp and practiced despite the suddenness of the attack. Patricia tried to crane her neck to get a glimpse of what was happening outside, but all she could see were flashes of movement, dark figures darting in and out of view as they took defensive positions. She pressed herself lower into the seat, the cold leather sticking to the back of her neck as adrenaline coursed through her veins. Her mind raced with questions. Who was shooting? Why now? The situation had already been explosive enough, and now it seemed as though the very ground beneath her had split open, unleashing a fresh wave of violence. Suddenly, the police car door yanked open, and one of the officers crouched beside her, his eyes wide with urgency. "We need to get you out of here, now," he shouted, barely pausing long enough for her to process his words before grabbing her arm and pulling her out of the car. Patricia stumbled forward, her body still sluggish from shock, but the officer was already moving, guiding her toward a nearby pillar where two other officers were crouched, weapons drawn. "Get down," another officer urged, his eyes scanning the area for threats. Patricia collapsed behind the pillar, her back pressed against the cold concrete, her hands trembling uncontrollably. Her stomach tightened as she tried to steady her breathing, the reality of the situation sinking in. There was a gunfight happening, and she was caught in the middle of it. Across the station, the gunfire continued, rapid and erratic. Patricia could hear the shouts of officers coordinating, barking orders, but there was no clarity, no sense of where the threat was coming from. The sound reverberated off the tiled walls, making it impossible to tell how close the shooters were. Just then, a figure appeared at the far end of the station, a man dressed in dark clothing, a mask obscuring his face. He moved with purpose, his footsteps slow and deliberate as he raised a handgun and fired toward the officers. Patricia's breath hitched in her throat as she watched the man advance, his movements cold and methodical. The police returned fire, the air filling with the sharp crack of bullets whizzing past. One of the officers closest to Patricia was hit. She heard the dull thud as the officer crumpled to the ground, his body jerking violently before going still. A strangled cry escaped her lips before she could stop it, the sight of the man bleeding out just feet away from her filling her with a new kind of terror. This was real, people were dying. This wasn't just a confrontation over a subway seat anymore. It was something far more sinister. Patricia clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms as she tried to keep herself from breaking down completely. The officer beside her returned fire, his focus locked on the advancing shooter, but the chaos was disorienting. Shadows darted everywhere, and the sound of more gunfire coming from other directions made it impossible to tell how many shooters there were or where they were positioned. "Stay here," the officer barked at Patricia before moving out from behind the pillar, firing toward the masked man. Patricia watched in horror as another figure emerged from the opposite side of the station, another shooter. This one was armed with a rifle, his posture rigid as he took aim and began firing at the officers without hesitation. The station had become a war zone. The second shooter's gunfire was louder, more deliberate, and with each shot, Patricia felt a fresh wave of panic surge through her. The officer who had told her to stay put took a bullet in the shoulder and fell to the ground with a sickening thud, his gun clattering across the platform. Patricia clapped her hands over her mouth, stifling a scream. She couldn't believe what was happening. What had started as a confrontation over a seat had escalated into a full-blown nightmare, one she couldn't wake up from. She pressed her back harder against the pillar, feeling the coldness seep into her skin as she squeezed her eyes shut. The sound of bullets ricocheting off the walls and the piercing cries of those caught in the crossfire were unbearable. Every instinct told her to run, to get away, but where could she go? There was no escape. She was trapped. The shooting seemed to go on forever, each second stretching into an eternity. Then, without warning, the gunfire stopped. Silence fell over the station, so sudden and complete that Patricia's ears rang with the absence of sound. She opened her eyes cautiously, her body frozen in place as she strained to listen. Had it ended? Were the shooters gone? But the silence was short-lived. The sound of footsteps echoed through the station, slow and deliberate. Patricia's heart skipped a beat as she realized the footsteps were coming toward her. She pressed herself flatter against the pillar, her breath catching in her throat. Then, a voice, low and menacing, cut through the silence. "You thought you could just walk away from this?" Patricia's blood ran cold. It was the older man, the one who had started the entire confrontation. His voice was unmistakable, dripping with venom. She didn't understand. How was he back? Hadn't the police taken him away? Patricia's mind raced, trying to piece together what was happening. Had he somehow orchestrated the attack? Was this all part of some twisted plan? The thought made her stomach turn. She had never imagined that a simple refusal to give up a seat could lead to something so violent, so terrifying. The footsteps grew closer, and Patricia knew she had to move. She couldn't stay behind the pillar any longer. Taking a deep breath, she inched her way along the edge of the pillar, her heart pounding in her chest. She needed to get out of the station, away from the man who seemed intent on seeing this through to the bitter end. But as she prepared to make a break for it, the older man's voice rang out again, this time closer. "I'm not done with you yet." Patricia's mind screamed at her to run, but her body felt like it was frozen in place. The sound of the older man's footsteps grew closer, his heavy boots echoing in the eerie silence of the now blood-stained subway station. She could barely breathe, the adrenaline in her veins making her limbs shaky and weak. She had no idea how he had escaped police custody, let alone orchestrated this massacre. Was he behind the gunman? Or was he just taking advantage of the chaos? Patricia crouched lower, trying to blend into the shadows behind the pillar, her heart slamming against her ribcage. She could hear his raspy breathing as he approached, each step calculated, like a predator hunting its prey. The floor was littered with shattered glass, spent bullet casings, and the bodies of the fallen. She could feel the cold weight of fear pressing down on her, making it hard to think clearly. The man's voice cut through the tension like a knife, dripping with malice. "You think you can just walk away from this? From me? You and your kind?" Her stomach churned with fear and anger. His hatred for her, for what she represented in his twisted mind, was palpable. She wasn't just a person to him, she was an embodiment of everything he despised. He saw her as less than human, and that made him all the more dangerous. Patricia's hand brushed against something cold and metallic on the ground. She looked down and saw it was a gun, likely dropped by one of the officers who had fallen. She hesitated, her pulse quickening. She had never handled a weapon before, didn't even know how to shoot, but she knew she had to do something, anything, to survive. Her fingers closed around the gun's grip, and she lifted it carefully, her heart thundering in her ears. Her body trembled as she tried to steady her breathing. She didn't have time to think this through. If he found her, there would be no talking her way out of it. He was too far gone, consumed by his hatred. The sound of his footsteps grew louder, closer. Patricia tightened her grip on the gun, her hands shaking as she tried to position herself. She wasn't sure if she could actually pull the trigger, but she knew she had to be ready for whatever came next. The man's shadow stretched across the floor, long and menacing, as he rounded the corner. "There you are," he said, his voice low and venomous. Patricia's heart seized in her chest. She stood, raising the gun with both hands, her arms trembling violently. The man froze for a moment, his eyes narrowing as they locked onto her. He didn't seem frightened by the sight of the weapon. In fact, he almost looked amused, as if the idea of her trying to fight back was some kind of joke to him. "You're gonna shoot me now," he sneered, taking a slow step forward. "You? Please." Patricia's finger hovered over the trigger, her pulse racing. She didn't know if she could do it. Her mind flashed to her unborn child, the life growing inside her, and suddenly the weight of everything crashed down on her. She had to survive. She had to protect her baby. There was no other choice. The man took another step forward, and Patricia squeezed the trigger. The gun clicked. Nothing happened. Her heart sank, panic flooding her veins as the man's lips curled into a twisted smile. "You think you're tough, huh? That you can just pick up a gun and everything will change?" His voice was mocking, his steps slow and deliberate as he closed the distance between them. "You're just like the rest of them. Weak. Helpless." Patricia backed away, her body shaking, but the man lunged forward before she could react. He knocked the gun out of her hands with a swift motion, sending it clattering to the ground. His hand closed around her wrist with bruising force, yanking her toward him. She tried to pull away, but he was too strong, his grip like iron. "You don't belong here," he hissed, his face inches from hers. "None of you do." Patricia struggled, trying to break free, but it was no use. He was stronger, fueled by his hate and madness. She could feel the edges of her vision darkening as fear and exhaustion overtook her. The smell of sweat and blood filled her nostrils, suffocating her. Suddenly, there was a loud bang. The man's grip loosened, and his body jerked violently. For a moment, Patricia didn't understand what had happened. His eyes went wide with shock, and then he crumpled to the floor, blood pooling beneath him. Patricia stumbled backward, gasping for air, her mind spinning. Behind the man stood one of the surviving police officers, his gun smoking from the shot he had just fired. He was panting heavily, his uniform stained with blood, but he managed to give her a quick nod. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Patricia could only nod, her body shaking uncontrollably as the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. The officer holstered his weapon and moved to check the man's body, making sure he was no longer a threat. The station was eerily quiet now. The gunfire had ceased, and the few remaining officers were sweeping the area, checking for survivors. Patricia stood in the middle of it all, her heart still racing, her mind struggling to process everything that had unfolded. The nightmare was over. As she stood there, staring at the lifeless body of the man who had tormented her, Patricia felt an overwhelming mixture of relief, grief, and exhaustion. She had survived. Against all odds, she had made it through the violence, the hatred, and the chaos. But she knew this experience would stay with her forever. It wasn't just about the man who had refused to give up his seat. It was about everything that had come after, the violence, the fear, the reminder of the deep-rooted hate that still existed in the world. But Patricia wasn't going to let that hate define her or her child's future. She placed a protective hand over her belly, feeling the life growing within her, and silently vowed to raise her child in a world where love and equality would always triumph over hatred. The nightmare was over, but the fight for a better future had only just begun.